It was a balmy morning as the sun rose over the Pacific Island of Ulithi in late 1944. The Reveille rang strongly on board the docked USS Mississinewa as sailors rushed to their posts, eager to fulfill their duties. The great American tanker had been filled with oil and aviation fuel. It was prepared to embark on another mission to supply the war efforts against Japan in the Pacific. With just a few months of service under her belt, Mississinewa promised a long and fruitful career. But as the sun peeked over the horizon, had an abrupt encounter with destiny. A massive explosion suddenly tore the tanker's hull in half, and the sailors didn't have a second to react before the flames reached the fuel tanks. An earth-shattering chain of detonations shook the ocean, lifting a series of terrifying water columns. In just a few minutes, USS Mississinewa was swallowed by the sea. Meanwhile, there was cause for celebration inside a Japanese submarine nearby. The crew heard the explosions and knew their torpedoes had struck true. They had also proved that their new secret weapon was effective and capable of turning the tide of the war. It was the KAITEN, a manned suicide projectile steered by a Japanese operator until the moment of impact. As the submarine crew reported sinking 5 American ships docked at the same port, the Imperial Japanese Navy immediately expanded the KAITEN program. However, their confidence was misguided. Utter desperation. Dark times were coming for the Japanese Empire. Despite their iron determination and ambitious efforts to hold the Allies back, everything seemed futile by 1944. After the destruction of several Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway and the continuous obliteration of their navy at the hands of the Pacific Fleet in U.S. submarines, Japan realized it no longer had the naval capabilities to defend its home islands. To make matters worse, the Allied advance had also deprived them of strategic resources, cutting off their supply lines in the Pacific. Japan was depleted, weakened, and lacking experienced pilots and servicemen. Still, they possessed 2 attributes in an almost unlimited capacity: the conviction to continue fighting, and young untrained men willing to give their lives for their emperor. Determined to do everything in their power to defend their home, the Japanese High Command organized the Japanese Special Attack Units, a task force designed to take both of their advantages and use them against the enemy. The Special Attack Force would use the numerous fanatic young men willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for Japan, and would send them on suicide attack missions in a desperate effort to cripple the U.S. Navy, even when Japan did not have the resources to defend itself. This program produced kamikaze pilots, Fukuryu frogmen, suicide boats, and even manned suicide torpedoes. If Japan could destroy enough U.S. ships using as few resources as possible, the nation would be able to buy time to rebuild its once mighty navy. Underwater kamikazes. The first suicide crafts produced by the Special Attack Force were the kamikaze aircraft. In just a few months, they proved helpful at taking down large vessels while spending little resources. Now, the Japanese Navy wanted to take the concept into a different set of applications, and Japan's most potent weapon against the American Navy was its pure oxygen torpedoes. The Type 93 and 95 torpedoes could be mounted on anything from large submarines to small attack boats, and they had the same chance of taking down a sizable U.S. warship. Still, torpedoes had a significant disadvantage, as they were ineffective at hitting moving ships, and submarines often had to surface to properly align a shot. However, the Japanese were eventually able to program the torpedoes with their target's approximate position, speed, and direction, which helped the weapon become more accurate. During the war, torpedo misses were extremely common, and as U.S. ships began to increase their armor on the sides, Japanese torpedo strikes became increasingly ineffective. Inspired by the kamikazes, Japanese engineers began to consider the idea of a manned torpedo that could be steered from within its hull and guarantee a hit in the most vulnerable section of an enemy ship. If the scheme worked, the weapon would be more accurate and more effective at a longer distance. The KAITEN. There was no time or interest in an extended developing cycle for the suicide torpedo. The Japanese needed a functional solution as soon as possible. Research on the technology began in February of 1944, and the Japanese engineers produced a working prototype only 4 months later. The design was extremely simple, consisting of nothing more than a Type 93 torpedo engine compartment attached to a cylinder where the pilots would control the craft. The warhead would be placed after the pilot section, ready to detonate after impact, and the projectile's pneumatic gyroscope was supplemented with an electronic control system, allowing the pilot to manually direct the payload. In practice, the pilot had limited control over the torpedo's direction, as the steering system was cumbersome and rudimentary. As such, a periscope was placed on the contraption's hull so that the operator could see the target and steer the craft according to its position. Every stage of the creation of the KAITEN was perilous and rushed, and the units were built hurriedly with little attention to safety protocols. Even the original designers of the craft, Lieutenants Hiroshi Kuroki and Sakio Nishina, perished while personally testing prototypes. Training. The men volunteering to sacrifice their lives for the Empire were usually 17 to 28-year-old recruits with no military experience. The patriotic indoctrination in Japan even resulted in numerous children joining the program pretending to be older. Furthermore, when the number of recruits dwindled, the officials turned a blind eye to many children joining their ranks. For the young men, conducting a suicide mission for the Emperor was a massive privilege. They often wrote proud letters to their friends and family before entering the program that would end their lives. Training took place on the island of Ojishima in the Inland Sea. The site was equipped with cranes, torpedo testing pits, launch ramps, and a large shallow bay for test running and firing. Initial training consisted of operating fast surface boats by periscope and instruments alone. Only when a pilot could maneuver a boat by periscope would he be capable of handling KAITENs. Training KAITENs were fitted with a mock warhead that contained telemetry equipment and an emergency air tank that could return the craft to the surface if the recruit dove too deep. The exercises began with simple circular runs to and from a fixed landmark at a decreased speed, but the training then evolved into faster and more hazardous runs around rocks and through pits in deeper water. As the runs became more hazardous, the pilots had to continuously surface to monitor their periscope and adjust their direction, while also adjusting trim tank levels according to a decrease of oxygen they were using as a catalyst. Then, when the trainers were confident about a pilot's skills, they would send him to open water training against target ships. This advanced training was done at full attack speed, at night or at twilight. Before graduating from the training program, pilots had to pass a submarine launch and dangerous open water runs before hitting their target ship. Many trainees were severely injured or lost their lives during their runs. Most of the time, the cause was the impact at high speeds against target ships. Combat action. Logic dictated that being able to manually steer the torpedo would mean that the KAITEN would deliver much superior results than the Type 93 Japanese Long Lance. Unfortunately for the ever more desperate Imperial Japanese Navy, this was not the case. In head-to-head comparisons made by the US, the unmanned Type 93 torpedo far surpassed the effectiveness of the KAITEN. In fact, the US only attributed the sinking of 3 ships to the daring Japanese weapon: that of the fleet oiler USS Mississinewa on November 20th, 1944, a small infantry landing craft, and the destroyer escort USS Underhill while operating northeast of Cape Engano on July 24th, 1945. In total, the KAITEN attacks took the lives of 187 Allied men. However, the risky nature of the KAITENs meant that the Japanese lost more men while deploying them than the enemies they could eliminate. 106 KAITEN pilots perished on board the suicide crafts. 846 sailors were lost when 8 Japanese submarines carrying KAITENs were destroyed, and 156 maintenance and support personnel also perished in action. Sinking performance. Despite the disastrous performance, the Japanese aggressively expanded the KAITEN program after the sinking of USS Mississinewa. The submarine crew that fired the KAITEN at the docked US ships mistakenly concluded they had destroyed numerous vessels because of the chained explosions and the enormous fireballs they witnessed at the site. However, they did not know that only a single KAITEN had reached its mark, and that the spectacular explosions were because of several tanks detonating. Being one of the combat debuts for the KAITEN, the Imperial Japanese Navy was left with the impression that the manned torpedo was formidably effective, and they continued to grow the initiative, going as far as producing 4 different variations. In reality, the KAITEN was an ineffective and dangerous craft, born out of fear and desperation. It could not produce positive results for Japan, much less turn the tides of the war. Thank you for watching our video. For more incredible war stories and the machines that made them possible, click on the screen and check out our other Dark Documentaries channels. We publish new content regularly, so stay tuned and don't miss a thing.